Hello and welcome to another episode of the TLDR UK podcast. I am Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined today by Ben Blissett, TLDR UK's lead writer, and Rory Taylor, TLDR Global lead writer.
Hello.
Yeah. Before we get into the sort of normal day-to-day of all this, we should just say, at the end of last year, we wrote a newspaper called Too Long. You might have seen it advertised on sort of the other channels, or maybe even here on TLDR podcasts. It was intended as sort of like year in review, economist style, like run through what's happened in the past 12 months. Obviously, we're now slightly into 2024, but the paper's still as relevant as it was, and we still have some spare copies. So we've done a little flash sale for the very reasonable price of just £5.99. You can now get a physical copy. There's also, if you can't wait for it and you just want to have it emailed to you instantaneously, there's also a digital copy for £3.99. I should say, I know obviously it was supposed to be sort of read at the end of the year, but like all of it's evergreen. There isn't really anything that's super time sensitive. Maybe like some of the Israel stuff, but a lot of it is still relevant and still very readable. And we are, jokes aside, really quite proud of it. I think it's pretty good. So if you like to support the channel, please do get a digital one. It's nice and easy. Anyway, that being said, let's get into the main bit of the podcast. So today in the main story, we're going to be talking about sort of two things. We're going to be talking about this plot that's been circulating in the right-wing tabloids here in the UK to oust Sunak, led by people like David Frost, who was obviously he was the chief Brexit negotiator back in those days. And we'll also be talking about the new plan, I think it was announced in the last 24 hours or so, to ban vapes, or at least disposable vapes, that the government has announced. But before we get into that, as is custom on this podcast, we are going to do our underreported stories.
So my underreported story is from Kenya. The High Court in Kenya has ruled that a deployment of police officers to Haiti that was meant to be led by Kenya, that deployment is unlawful. So it can't actually go ahead. And I think it's quite a big story for a few reasons. One is I think the situation in Haiti is massively underreported. It's the state has basically totally collapsed there in the last few years. The president was assassinated in 2021. They've had an acting president since then. All of the elected institutions and officials have expired effectively. So there is effectively no proper state. There's a huge amount of gang violence, kidnappings. There's outbreaks of disease, shortages of all sorts of things, and I think gangs now control something like 80% of the capital. And amid all of that, the acting president had been calling for this UN-backed deployment of some kind of security force to try and stabilise the situation. Last year, it was finally approved by the UN Security Council, and it was meant to be led by Kenya, by deployment of Kenyan police officers, because there hadn't really been any countries that were willing to lead it apart from Kenya. But now this High Court in Kenya has said this is unlawful. So it's kind of thrown the whole mission into doubt, and kind of leaving people in Haiti, not really sure what's going to happen. So I think that's pretty underreported story.
I mean, what happened in Haiti is obviously like an example of a complete state failure. You often talk in slightly hyperbolic terms about like country X becoming a failed state, and we're very guilty of that, obviously, on TLDR Global. But that it really is a proper state failure there. Yeah. And it's always sad when you compare it to the Dominican Republic, which is on the same island. Which has actually been relatively successful in both economic and political terms over the last 50 years or so. And the comparison is really quite glaring. Anyway, Ben, what's your underreported story?
Yeah, well, mine is about the Che Gonzalez, which I know that you wrote a video on relatively recently. About this topic. But I thought I'd bring it up again because no one watched it.
So, Rich, you don't want to get into this here. I will ruin you in public.
I had to do the little cheap dig. Anyway, it is a genuinely very interesting story. I think it was a well-made video, Zach. It's a very well-made video.
Big mistake.
It basically, the reason I think it's underreported is just that we're very involved in it. It's part of the British Indian Ocean Territory, so a British overseas territory. So the UK is sort of inherently involved in this. It's been part of the British overseas territory for ages. It was originally French. There was a lot of, I think, slaves that had gone over there. France signed it over to the UK in the Treaty of Paris, so it'd been part of British territory since then. But in like the 1960s, the US wanted to build a military base on there, so they moved all the Chagassians out and told them they couldn't come back, and that has been the case for the last 40 or 50 years, and they now reside in Mauritius. Now, Mauritius has taken quite a hostile stance towards the UK in the last few years. Specifically in 2021, they passed a bill that said if you're in Mauritius and you refer to the islands as being British, you could be liable to criminal sanctions, including up to 10 years in prison. So they've taken a very hostile stance towards the UK and their claim of sovereignty there. But in the last few days, a lot of right-wing think tanks have been pushing Sunak to sort of be more aggressive towards Mauritius in this regard, specifically to cut aid payments. So it's about £3 million that we send to Mauritius. They want him to sort of cut that as a retaliation against their sort of these rules that they've introduced, specifically about the Chagos Islands and sovereignty. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it's also interesting because the sort of the cabinet ministers that are very much have authority over this. So Grant Shapps, who's the Defence Secretary, and Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, oppose ceding control back to Mauritius in this regard. And Boris Johnson has claimed that giving up the archipelago would damage the security ties with the White House because, obviously, as I said, they built the whole reason that this is sort of kicking off is because the US has a naval base there. So it's all very interesting. I think it's it was a very good topic to do a video on.
Thank you very much.
Because it's we're very involved in this, and I think people don't often know about that and overseas territories.
I think there's an interesting sort of link with the ICJ ruling on Israel from the other day, because I think the UK has twice lost, or has been on the the losing side of international court rulings on the Chagos Islands, and the UK government has just rejected those, and it just kind of goes to show the limited ability for world courts to actually enforce what are technically legally binding decisions. So I think that's kind of interesting.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think I think the ICJ rulings aren't as absolutely against the British as you might suppose, but yeah, I think it is one of those where you mentioned that most of them went to Mauritius, most of the Chagosians. I'm not sure that's actually true. I mean, it's quite hard to find out quite where they went to. Quite a lot of them went to the Seychelles and parts of basically the east, the southern tip of India.
But it is certainly true that there is a portion of them went to Mauritius.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I don't want to get into it. Please go watch the whole video there. But just geographically as well, if you look at a map, I mean, the Chagos Islands are miles away from Mauritius. They're something like 2,500 kilometres away, and they're far closer to the Seychelles. And I can't remember, there's an archipelago that's a little bit 700 kilometres north that perhaps would instinctively make more sense to administer those territories. But whatever, it is a really interesting story, and it's one of those sort of another reminder of the sort of the shadow of colonialism, the long shadow of colonialism. It's also something, by the way, that I think the Americans have got away with very well here, because they basically said, "Oh, it's up to you guys, the British." Yeah. But actually,
they're the ones that built the naval base.
Yeah, and the Americans are the ones who really don't want to lose to the Seychelles, because to Mauritius. And Mauritius have said, "Oh, we promise you a 99-year lease on the islands." But it's just a verbal promise. And Mauritius has one of those, it's one of those island territories which has become this focal point in the wider Sino-American rivalry, where domestic politicians are sort of constantly trying to be bored off by either side. And you can imagine from the American perspective, the idea of, let's just say, a sort of anti-American government coming in Mauritius, and that would be pretty spooky for them, especially if Mauritius controlled the Chagos Islands. But yeah, I mean, I think in a sense it was never going to happen, given that the Americans have that base, and that if we, sort of implied that we were open to it, I'm sure the Americans would be a bit more vocal about their opposition to the plan. But they've got away scot-free here. They look like the good guys.
It's remarkable, isn't it? Yeah.
Let's move on to the main part of the video. Do you want to start with the vape ban or the plot to oust Sunak?
Should do vapes?
Go on then. So what's happened in the last day or so?
So the government has sort of announced, and remarkably announced on Lad Bible of all of the outlets, that they're going to be introducing a ban on vapes. I really want to. I think this is just remarkable that they've announced it on Lad Bible of all fucking places. I mean, some people on Twitter have just sort of shared some of the articles and things they were posting about 10 years ago when they started. And the idea that it's gone from that to now where the government are making announcements on policy is just genuinely mad. What world are we living in?
I know. I don't think the government should be on Twitter, let alone Lad Bible. I mean, it's madness.
I know. I mean, if anyone's watching, if you have to, just have a look at some of the posts. And if you don't know who they are, have a look at their posts from about 10 years ago, because it's mad that they're now making announcements on there. But anyway, they are. So they announced yesterday that they're going to be banning, and the key thing here is disposable vapes. So I don't really know how much the audience knows are from the UK, but it is a big thing at the minute amongst. Oh, I sound so old. It's apparently a big thing amongst children these days.
Epidemic.
Yeah, it's a vaping epidemic. Apparently, it's a thing the youth are into these days. But no, so
go on.
Yeah. So the whole thing about them is that they sell them in these crazy flavours and
Sounds so stuffy. These crazy flavours. I mean, they've got watermelon. What is it?
Yeah. Well, they're designed. They're designed very much, if you see them, to appeal to kids. And obviously, kids aren't allowed to buy them. They've got nicotine, or no, they don't. They do have nicotine in. Some of them have nicotine in. So under 18s can't buy them, but they often do. And there's this statistic that the Action on Smoking and Health charity found that about 7.6% of 11 to 17-year-olds vape regularly or occasionally at the minute, which is up from only 4.1% in 2020. And if you just think about that, like 7% of kids are vaping, which is, is really, really not good. And it's largely driven by these disposable vapes that are a lot more branded towards children. They're very bright colours, very sort of almost like childish sort of.
And they're cheap as well.
Yeah, they're very cheap. So it's sort of bad for kids, kind of bad for the environment as well. Got lithium batteries in, which can't really be disposed of very well. So the government has decided to sort of take action on this and just ban them outright. Key thing is they're not banning vapes overall. It's just these disposable ones, these ones that are marketed towards children and are very bad environmentally because of these lithium batteries. So that's what they're doing. They've promised that they're going to. So the health secretary said that this legislation will go through before the time of the next gen. Why are you smiling at me?
You're just so hip and down with the kids. I just love it, like slandering vapes for using lithium batteries. It's such a... Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, obviously.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought you were big on the environment. Anyway, so the health secretary said that they're going to introduce this ban before the next general election. It could go through with some already ongoing some health legislation that's already going through. It could be a specific bill. They haven't announced that yet. Starmer has said that he, surprise, surprise, agrees with the bill, but that the government has taken too long to implement it. Should have done it 2 years ago. So, yeah, being very much the leader of the opposition. But, yeah, this is going through. And as I say, the most remarkable thing about this really is how it was announced and the fact it was through Lad Bible.
Yeah. Also, I mean, there were two genuinely quite serious points we made here. I mean, the first is about the implosion of Sunak's social media strategy. I think that's fair to say, because when he came in, everyone was talking about how great he was at social media, how great his branding was, and all that sort of thing. But this is just the latest example of some, I think, cringes. We aspire to neutrality here at TLDR News, but I think it's fair to say, some pretty cringe social media stuff. You also saw. Obviously, there was the Lee Anderson interview that he did a while ago.
We did a whole episode on this last week, Zach.
Yeah, we did. But then there was also, did you talk about the Nigel Farage AI thing that he did as well?
Thing. I don't think that had happened when we recorded it, but that is also mad.
Well, we should just explain what that is. I mean, basically, Sunak did this thing on the Conservative website where you could pay and you could get a sort of personalised message from Sunak being like, "Hi, Zach, I'm working my hardest to stop the boats and bring down inflation." And then obviously someone did one for Nigel Farage. So you have this weird sort of AI version of Rishi Sunak walking around his house talking about how, "Hi, Nigel, I'm working so hard to stop the boats. I know it's your top priority." But yeah, so it's the latest example of like a bit of a social media gaffe, I think it's fair to say, from Sunak. But also it's, maybe I'm sort of like getting too deep into this, but ideologically it is quite interesting because it's quite sort of, nanny state is a sort of, that's what the Daily Mail would describe as. It's quite sort of activist, it's quite interventionist, it's quite big state. And it's not the sort of politics we're used to seeing, for at least traditionally, from the Conservative Party. And it's not the sort of politics that will necessarily go down well with bits of his own parliamentary party, because we saw some quite serious opposition to the smoking ban that he suggested a while ago.
I think this is distinct from that, in that he sort of targets, I think that, yes, it is big state, and yes, I can see that faction of the Tory party usually being upset about that sort of thing. But I think that the fact that it's targeting people who are underage using vapes and are being exposed to nicotine, I just think that they won't form as much opposition as they did to the smoking ban. I don't see there being any significant backlash to
You don't
this
think it's
at
going to
all.
be the straw that breaks the camel's
No,
back?
I really don't. And to be quite honest, did we really see that much backlash for the smoking ban? We saw a little bit, but it wasn't.
Well, smoking ban hasn't actually happened.
No, it hasn't happened, but
it's just a plan.
Yeah, but it certainly will. Like, there's no. There'll be some that will speak out and have smoked for God knows how many years, and will feel like it's government being too interventionist. But I think the numbers will be so small, and I think this is going to be even less likely because it doesn't stop vaping in the same way that the smoking ban just stopped smoking, and it targets mainly people who shouldn't be vaping anyway. So there's not any sort of real.
The only last thing for people on the smoking ban that I think is interesting is the smoking ban is almost like a copy paste from a policy that originated in New Zealand under Jacinda Ardern, but that has since been reversed. So they announced the policy, and then the new New Zealand government have reversed the smoking ban. So it'd be interesting. We'll be the only country basically that is going with the sort of full-throated smoking ban aimed to eliminate smoking. Anyway, let's get on to the meat of the podcast. We are talking about this sort of like it's like a slow burner of a story, but basically over the past like week or so, we've had a series of like conspicuously badly timed polls for Sunak, quite expensive ones, a big MRP poll done by YouGov, published in the Telegraph, that have been funded by like this new, slightly mysterious conservative pressure group. And it's sort of come out in the last couple of days that there is this concerted effort going on behind the scenes by some disgruntled right-wing, I think Tory MPs and donors is probably fair to say, who want to get rid of Sunak before the next election.
And SPADs.
Yeah, that was weird, wasn't it?
Well, we'll get on to the one particular SPAD soon because it's just a
I want to say what a SPAD is just quickly.
Yes, it's a special advisor who works for the government, but they're usually brought in, generally seen as quite temporary, for a specific prime minister on a specific policy area.
Yeah, they're not civil
servants. They're not
servants.
members of the civil service. They're not expected to be neutral. They are very much appointed for that specific prime minister. But as I say, we'll get onto that in a second. But the pressure group that we're talking about here is one called the Conservative Britain Alliance. And as you say, very shady, not much is known about them. We know that Lord Frost, as you said at the beginning, very much a big player in the old Brexit days, is involved in this. And he's been sort of approached by Tory whips and said that if any of the backers for this group turn out to have funded people like Reform UK and Nigel Farage, then he'll lose the whip. He's assured them that they're not involved in that, but hasn't given any more information about their names, details, who they are, who they're backing, or anything like that. All we know about this Conservative Britain Alliance is that they're not massive fans of Rishi Sunak, and they're doing as much as they can to cause problems with him. And the first big thing that they've really done is that massive YouGov poll that cost £40,000 and was funded by the Conservative Britain Alliance, which is kind of, I don't know what to make of. Like, is that about what you'd expect for a big poll like that? I suppose it probably is.
I think with all these things, it's always weird because when you're talking about like sort of like donor money in politics, your frame of reference is always American because that's the big stories you get, and it's like spend millions of dollars on campaign ads in Iowa or whatever. And you forget that in the UK, we just don't have that much cash.
Yeah. There's just no money for anything.
Yeah. Boris Johnson's basically a book deal away from becoming Prime Minister at any time. So.
So true.
But go on.
Yeah, so that poll found that, and we've mentioned this a load, but that Labour are on course for 120-seat majority, Tories reduced to 169 seats. So it was like this big damaging poll, and then there were a load of polls after that showed them on this huge 20-something point deficit. The Tories on a 20-something point deficit and all of this. They've been sort of causing problems. The only people that we know that are involved is they've suggested that there are about 10 MPs that were involved in this, they're sometimes referred to as like a rebel alliance, which I think gives them more...
very Star Wars.
Yeah, very Star Wars,
the Sith Lords of Westminster. Though.
Yeah, I think we'll be probably as successful as the people in Star Wars as well.
Very good.
But...
although the Rebel Alliance were very successful in Star Wars.
Okay, well, they'll be less successful.
My reference is all over the place. Let's just... Sorry, that was shit. We look old again. Let's just move on.
Anyway, Star Wars.
So we don't really know how many people are involved in this group. We know that there was probably around 10 MPs that were involved. Simon Clarke called for Sunak to go and supposedly briefed a load of papers that there were tons of people that were going to come out and back him and that there was going to be this concerted push, and no one did. It was just him. It was just Simon Clarke that came out. I think Andrea Jenkins sort of said something.
I think that was before, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's supposedly involved in the group, or we've got indication that he could be involved.
Yeah, no, I think that in anything that was sort of counterproductive, wasn't it? It does look like it actually made the Tory party more united, Simon Clarke's intervention, because you've got that rally around the flag effect, and even sort of like Sunak skeptic MPs were saying like now is not the time. We cannot have a new leader.
Was one of them.
We cannot have a new leader before the next election. But they are sort of optimistic, aren't they? This like anti-Sunak group, because they think there are basically going to be two crunch points for Sunak. We've got these by-elections coming up in February, and then we have the local elections in May. Well, do you think either of those could be the thing that tips it over
will
for
both
Sunak?
be very bad events for Sunak and the Conservative Party generally, you know, as if polling is to be believed, which probably should be at this point. But it feels like we keep getting these like anonymous briefings about, you know, however many dozen Conservative MPs there are actually wanting to get rid of Sunak. But any time it kind of comes to like a crunch moment, they never seem to materialise, whether it's like the Rwanda vote where there are only a few and then they kind of all back down towards the end, or like with the Simon Clarke rebellion, it was just him and no one else came out to support him. You know, there might be a handful of people saying he needs to go when they lose 2 by-elections in February, but
They don't have a good track record.
no, everything suggests that they don't actually have as much power or as many numbers as
terrible at expectation management.
Yeah.
Like maybe if you were like, oh, this is like a, this is the first step, but every time they're like, this is it, he's coming down, and then there's like 3 of them vote against.
I think it's interesting because the incentive early on is to try and make it seem like it's this big moment, so you encourage other MPs to back you. But when that doesn't materialise, you're then in a really awkward position where you've kind of got to, do the complete opposite and say, well, this wasn't the moment, there were going to be other moments and all this. So you really have to try and like build that momentum really quickly, because no one's going to want to join a rebellion that's doomed to fail.
Yeah.
So you've got to make it seem like this rebellion is definitely going to work. We're definitely going to take Sunak down. This is the time. This is the Rwanda vote. We're going to do all of this. And then, when it doesn't happen, doing that humiliating, back down. And that's what we've seen in the last few months. And I'm with you.
The thing I find just completely baffling is that there are people in the Conservative Party who obviously want to be the next leader, but why do they think that doing it before the next election is the optimal time to do it? Like after the next election, when I guess they might be worried that they'll lose their seat and won't have a chance to run for leadership.
I think that probably is the anxiety. I think they probably think they would do better at the next election than Sunak.
I don't even think that it's the people who want to be leaders that are pushing that too hard. I think that if you do want to be a leader, you probably... There's a part of you that thinks that waiting until after the election is better. I just think it's the MPs that are concerned they're about to lose their jobs. And if we can just get somebody else in, we might be able to steady the ship, or, we'll still lose, but maybe not as much. I don't think it's necessarily like leadership ambitions that's driving this. I think it's more MPs concerned about losing their seats.
So I think we're all sceptical basically that this is going to come to anything. But the only caveat I think I would put in there is at the by-elections and obviously the local elections, is if Reform actually perform well. Because Reform are currently polling at like 12%. People who don't know, Reform are this like sort of the successor to UKIP, maybe, or the successor to the Brexit Party. And they're currently led by Richard Tice, who is just not Nigel Farage, not a very good politician. But there's been a lot of anxiety, especially on the right of the Tory party, that the Tories are going to start losing votes, to Reform on the right, and then having already lost a whole load of votes to Labour in the centre and the left. And that is what really could turn this into like a catastrophic loss for the Tories. There's something similar happened to the Canadian Conservatives in 1993, when they lost votes to both sides and then ended up just dying as a party. But so far, even though they've polled okay, even though that Reform, according to most latest YouGov poll, polling on like 12-13%, which is really quite high. I mean, it's only like 7 points behind the Tories. They never materialise at actual elections. So like by-elections, you don't see Reform actually performing well. And the obvious answer to this is that people are like in protest, saying, "Oh, I'll vote for Reform," and then when it actually gets to the ballot box, there's just they don't really want Reform. But if Reform actually do start performing well in those local elections, I think the Tories, the anxiety will really tick up a notch. And I then think you could actually plausibly see like a panicked removal of Rishi Sunak. And I don't know who they get back. I mean, Kemi Badenoch seems to be like the top choice. But that is, I think, when you get into real like crunch time for the Tories, and they might get spooked. I think obviously the other thing here is Nigel Farage. If Nigel Farage does return to Reform, then you can imagine Reform's polling going up by like a couple of points and people actually voting for him.
I think as well, it's just so worth saying that 12 points in the polls is just huge. I know that I agree with you. It won't materialise. I agree that you've got to treat that with a pinch of salt. But that's what the Lib Dems are currently polling on, and they're
Spinners above the Lib Dems.
Well, yeah. So I mean, some of the poll trackers put them basically level, but it's maybe slightly higher. But yeah, around the 10 mark, is what the Lib Dems are on at the minute. And they're predicted to have a resurgence back to 2005. And now, obviously, even more caveats apply with that because first past the post, the Lib Dems concentrate their votes, whereas Brexit, the Reform vote is going to be split across the UK, so they're not going to do as well.
What was that? There was an election where UKIP won 14% of the vote and got one seat, wasn't it?
2015, yeah. So it's not that, but as you say, the bigger point with that is how much they're going to be detracting from the Tories. And I absolutely agree. If we see any sort of semblance of a Reform UK vote in council elections or by-elections, then I really can see the momentum shifting upwards. And I think that in all of the things that have been written about this plot to undermine Sunak, they see the next 3 months as like the crucial time because of these two votes to get rid of Sunak. So if they're going to do it, these next 3 months, some time between these two votes, will be the time. And if they don't do it then we're definitely going to have Sunak
I mean, at that
at the
point,
election.
You're so close to the next election that if someone does replace him, that they really don't have long to radically turn things around.
No, but I think you get the advantage there is you get to sell yourself on I haven't had enough time.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm new
Give me a
and
chance.
I'm different. Yeah. Like Kenny Barnock would sell herself on like I'm actually tough on immigration. They're not this like soft liberal Sunak. I'm actually going to fix it. I don't have the time. Which I mean, to be honest, I genuinely think she would do a better job with would-be Reform voters than Sunak anyway. But I think and I think it's interesting because when we start this conversation, I basically was going to dismiss this is all nonsense. But I do think that it's a non-trivial chance that Reform perform well enough to put real pressure on Sunak at either of those sets of elections. Is that everything? We happy with that?
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier about the SPAD, so I did just want to return to
yeah,
this.
cool, sorry.
There is there's a guy. Have you heard of this guy called Will Dry?
Yeah.
You both heard of him. So I hadn't heard of him until this.
Oh, I only heard of him since this
I don't think anyone heard of
him.
No, but it's just so he's 26. He co-founded a group called Our Future, Our Choice, which was an EU advocacy group specifically for younger people, so quite left wing. And this was after he'd supposedly voted Leave, then went back to basically wanting to rejoin, advocated for a second referendum, stuff like that. Then he was employed by Sunak after he took charge after Liz Truss.
He doesn't sound like an opportunist at all. I mean,
I know, as a SPAD, and he's been he's 26 years old, and he's been described by some people as like Dominic Cummings-esque, and he resigned a couple of weeks ago, and he's supposedly part of this group to try and undermine Sunak, and is part of apparently about 10, 12 SPADs that were all working to try and undermine him as part of this rebel group. But I'd never heard of this guy at all, and his career trajectory is just mad.
He's like speed running a political career, basically, by the sounds of it.
He is, but isn't it also just a bit embarrassing, like the level of political discourse in this country? The fact that we've actually got like headlines about some 26-year-old bloke. I mean, he's just a SPAD. He's a fired SPAD.
You can imagine
resigned.
10 former SPADs feeling like they're kind of in a really... I don't know,
it's a really Westminster bubble story is what I'm getting at here, and it will have very little import on the trajectory of the UK, just the UK generally, won't it? I mean, it's just sort of irrelevant. I just get irked when we dedicate like a Telegraph dedicates like a whole page to...
And not about you instead.
I don't want to be on the Telegraph. Desperately not.
That's fair.
Anyway, let's move on to the fun bit of the podcast, the Global Leader Leaderboard. Okay, so welcome to the World Leader Leaderboard. For those of you who don't know what's going on, this is when each of these sort of guests picks a politician who's had a good week, or since we last did the podcast, and someone who's had a bad week, and we move them up or down. Just to stress, as always, this is not a reflection of our personal politics. This is just from that politician's perspective. Had they had a good week? Have they achieved their goals or fallen short of them? Rory, do you want to start, and do you want to give us who's going down?
Yes. Going down for me is Benjamin Netanyahu for one main obvious reason. I think we probably there's two sides to this probably, but I think overall he's going down because of the ICJ provisional ruling on the genocide case, which basically the ICJ basically said South Africa's allegations of genocide against Israel are plausible enough to continue with the case, and they've issued a load of measures that Israel technically has to comply by, but whether it actually does remains to be seen. I think there's a lot to be said about what the impact on Israel might be, and some people could say this might strengthen Israel and kind of emboldening it against like the kind of institutions that have sided against Israel and that kind of thing. But I think fundamentally it's bad for Israel that they are now going to spend the next 2 years or so on trial for genocide effectively. for alleged genocide. And I also think it does sort of galvanize the kind of pro-Palestine, anti-Israel movements in various countries. So there's a lot of people making the case that countries like the UK and others should stop exporting weapons and kind of doing any kind of military assistance with Israel because of this ICJ ruling. And it kind of provides like some legitimacy that is a lot harder to kind of just sweep aside when kind of people are saying, you know, this country should do X, Y, and Z because of what Israel's doing in Gaza. But I think, fundamentally, it's bad.
I think it's basically unequivocally bad for Israel. Surely, I mean, like you're right to mention that Israel hasn't paid much heed to what international institutions, especially UN-led ones, have said so far. But I do, of course, in like the
grand scheme of things,
and also just politically, it's just a terrible look politically. And even if you're already isolated, it's worse to be even more aggressively isolated. Anyway, Ben, who is going down for you?
Yeah, so Viktor Orban is going down as Hungary's Prime Minister. Basically, he's been threatened by Brussels. So he's been threatening to veto a Ukraine aid package. Brussels hit back and has now said that they're going to sort of explicitly target Hungary's economic weaknesses and imperil its currency if they do actually proceed with this veto. So this was the sort of secret documents that were seen by the FT originally about this. So, you know, it looks like as much as Orban has been sort of trying to exert his influence and been able to sort of use his position to push through this veto, it looks like the EU isn't just going to sort of roll over and let him. They're going to sort of push back quite hard. So it's not a particularly great look for Orban.
I think this is genuinely like such a fascinating story. I think it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. The first, I think, is that it's sort of a demonstration. I don't want to sound too pretentious when I say this, but that everything in a sense is political ultimately. I mean, obviously Orban is legally protected insofar as there's like legal limits on what the EU like can do to him. And obviously he like legally has this veto that's enshrined in like EU statute. But it's one of those things where if there's sufficient sense in the EU that we need to punish Orban, we need to coerce him into doing something. An EU official actually even described it as blackmail, but they basically justified it in terms that Orban's been blackmailing us with his veto for ages. We're not to blackmail him back. That people can force you to do stuff if you want to do it. The other reason I think it's really, really interesting is it demonstrates the fact that basically every developed state is reliant on international capital markets for financing. And this is something that we, us humble Brits, learned during the Liz Truss era, because it wasn't, I mean, when the Liz Truss's mini budget went to pieces, it wasn't because, I don't know, like British citizens or like British pensioners were deciding like, oh, I don't want to trust my money with this government. It's because international capital markets decided they didn't want to trust their money with the UK government. And it provided really quite a hard constraint on Liz Truss's like, not just her like economic power, but like her political power. And that's actually quite a new phenomenon. I mean, like for most of the 20th century, governments mainly finance their borrowing by borrowing just off their citizenry. So that you just borrow, if you're the British government, you would just borrow off Brits. And then because obviously there's just more capital available and it's more efficient and there's not so much of a difficult politics to it. In the late 20th century and obviously now, these countries started borrowing off international capital markets. And it sort of makes sense in the short term, but it like changes the politics of borrowing. And it means you have this very, very hard constraint on what you can and can't do. Because if you're like Hungary and you just need international capital markets to like function financially without sort of collapsing into autarky, then the EU can leverage that in really, really powerful ways. But yeah, so I do think that's interesting. The last thing I say is there's some countries that don't really do it. Like Italy is a really interesting example of a country that mainly borrows off its citizenry, which is one of the reasons why when basically the EU is trying to get Italy to default on some of its bonds, they're like, we can't do that because that wouldn't mean like, oh, we're not giving money to the Germans or to like some big, multinational American corporation. That means we're not giving money back to Italians, which would cause a massive recession. But yeah, so I think that is an interesting thing. I think that's a great story. And I also think it's another story about the EU showing a little bit of geopolitical agency. The EU has been quite like soft and soppy for a while, and now it's it's getting a little bit harder. Yeah.
On its own member state, which is kind of fun.
True. But also, it's a symptom of a more general trend. Yeah, but a fair point. Anyway, who is going? I guess we're doing up now, aren't we?
Yeah, I can do my person going up.
Yeah, please.
I'm moving Erdogan up, Turkish president, mainly because of the US finally approving sales of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey.
Yeah, not at all related to the Sweden NATO
completely
thing.
separate. I mean, we're talking about blackmail and stuff like that. This is just another one of those situations. But it's just been this long-running saga intertwined with all sorts of things. Most recently, the Swedish NATO bid, which Turkey has now approved. Still waiting Hungary though.
A little bit. So
so Sweden obviously applied to join NATO alongside Finland. Finland eventually made it in relatively quickly. Sweden's was held up mostly by Turkey because Turkey accused Sweden of effectively harbouring Kurdish terrorists, and Turkey was did I say Kurdish terrorists?
Yeah.
Kurdish terrorists. So Turkey was demanding that Sweden toughen up its anti-terror laws, its
and crack down specifically on Kurdish separatist groups.
What's the word for deporting extraditing? Extradition laws. And Sweden made some moves to do that, hoping to kind of get Turkey on side. And it seemed like they had, and then Turkey kind of continued to stall the application, and then started linking it to this deal for F-16 fighter jets that had kind of been put on ice with the US. And there's been a lot of behind the scenes negotiating between the US and Turkey. And now the White House has finally approved that sale. I think it still has to go through Congress, but I think it is expected to. So Erdogan, it's kind of just proved he leveraged his veto very effectively, and it went pretty well for him.
He's the king of geopolitics. I'm not even joking. That man just gets what he wants.
Yeah.
I think we should. Yeah, the thing I'll say on that as well is that so Turkey didn't explicitly link the F-16s to the accession, but they did a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah.
And it's very entertaining because only a year ago, the foreign minister was asked, is this about the F-16s coming? And he was like, how dare you? How dare you accuse us of playing politics with NATO succession? And then obviously that's exactly what it was. And I think if you asked him today, he'd still say no, it's just a coincidence. They just happened to be approved at the same time. I think that's a great story. The only caveat I would say is I do think Erdogan has a bit of a problem in that the Turkish economy is still struggling and the lira is still declining, despite the fact that he has basically completely reversed his unorthodox sort of Islamic-inspired monetary policy that he was pursuing for the last couple of years, which basically involved just never ever raising interest rates. And he's introduced some a very orthodox central banker and finance minister, but they haven't done enough to basically stem the sort of capital outflows that are currently going on in Turkey. Ben, who is going up for you?
Well, it's Fumio Kishida.
He's climbing.
He is climbing. So I think it was last week that I did, as my underreported story, something about the Japanese moon landing. The fact that they lost control. I can already see you're not too thrilled about this. But I think they became either the 5th or 6th nation ever to land something on the moon. So it's sort of a big moment. And they lost control of the rover because of it was sort of parked in the wrong bit, so it couldn't get light on it, so it couldn't recharge. They turned it off for about a week to try and it wasn't certain that the mission would even continue. It wasn't certain it would be able to recharge the mission. But as of this weekend, it was able to. They've continued with it, and it's not that it's back on track. It's going, and I think this is a big moment for them. It's you've one of only a very small number of nations to have ever been able to land on the moon, and not only have they done that, but the mission looks like it could actually be successful in the end. So that's very good news. It's very good news. That's why it's going up. Lucky. That's why it's going to be at the top of the board very soon.
Lucky.
It's gone up 2 episodes in a row.
Very different reasons, I imagine.
Probably the least popular leader on that board, and he's somehow not at the bottom.
Well, Putin is at
popular,
the top.
Domestically popular. Kishida domestically not very popular. Anyway,
fair enough.
I think that's everything for today. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the episode of the podcast. And if you feel like it, please do support the channel by buying one of our newspapers. We really are proud of them, and we really do think they are quite good. Anyway, thank you very much. And if you're a big fan of the channel, I will see you again on Thursday.
All right.
Well, there you go.